everyone, this is Aeroclass Expert Talks and my name is Lawrie. Without a doubt, safety is a number one priority for all involved in aviation, from aircraft captain and cabin crew to ground service handlers and airport workers. For everyone, the shared goal is to have a plane take off and land safely. We usually have about 100,000 flights per day, and all personnel involved in it has to make sure that their part of the job is done properly and according to safety regulation. As passengers, we are also surrounded by information about our safety, be it a flight attendant's pre-flight presentation or various booklets and posters at the airport. Today, I am joined by Deborah Lawrie, an expert in aviation safety investigations. And we will talk to her about safety in this industry and everywhere else. So thank you for joining me today, Deborah.
Thanks, Laura. Lovely to be with you.
So I'm gonna jump right in with all of our expert talks. We begin with a simple question. So how did aviation come to your life?
Well, it was a little bit by accident, if you pardon the pun there. But my father, when I was about 14, my father took up flying lessons as a hobby. And I was the eldest child, and I was quite interested in what he was doing. And so I helped him learn checklists and learn all the well, I was with him when he was doing all the theory, and he was explaining things to me. And so I got interested myself, and I used to go and watch him take a lesson at the airport, and I would just wait for him until he got back. And on one occasion, I was very lucky to be able to sit in the back seat of the aircraft. It wasn't quite legal, but it was. I was allowed to do it on this occasion, and that really got my interest sparked, and I wanted to learn myself, of course, but I was too young still. So my father said that he would give me a couple of lessons when I turned 16. So when I reached that age, which was 2 years later, I had 2 lessons, which he gave to me. And then after that, he said I had to do it all myself. So I had to do a whole lot of very strange jobs for not too much money to pay for each lesson. And I could only have about 1 a month. That was all I could manage. But I wanted to stick with it just to go solo, just to more or less prove to him that I could at least just fly the airplane by myself. But when I went solo, which was when I was still 16, it was something magical happened, and I thought, oh, I have to actually keep going. I can't stop.
So I guess from the age of 16, you never really looked back on your choice to join this industry.
Yeah, well, I didn't know what the industry would have ahead for me, but I wanted to continue to learn to fly, so to get a private license. And once I did that, I then moved on and did a commercial license. Then I got an instructor's rating, and so on and so on. So I sort of moved into the industry that way.
You see. And you now have more than 20 years of experience in this, and I'm sure there are some assignments or maybe projects or maybe some, flights that you had that really stand out. So can you tell us more about that?
Well, going to the 20 years, that would be very kind, because that would only make me a lot younger. But no, I've had more than 50 years in the industry. Yeah. But I've had probably more than 20 years in safety. So I think that's where that comes from. In terms of what was the most interesting assignment, if I'm thinking about my work in airline safety, it would have been at the time that Latvia was joining the EU, And the Netherlands, I was flying with KLM at the time, and the Netherlands were given the task of aligning the Latvian safety investigation process with the EU. And so I went over there with a team of people, and we delivered instruction to the investigators in Latvia to teach them, or to align them with the standards in the West. And it was a really, really interesting time for me. It was in Riga, and it was a mixture of Russian people and Latvian people. I mean, I know that in view of what's going on at the moment, this is probably makes me think very much about these people now, because they were very keen to become part of the EU. And so it's a little bit disturbing to see what's going on at the moment. But that was probably one of the most interesting assignments, because there was a difference in the way in which particularly the Russian people approached this subject.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you, I'm sure you've dealt with many different cultures and, many different people around the world in this matter. Is there a different approach than, let's say, to what Americans are doing and Australians are doing than maybe, Europeans are doing?
Oh, yes. When we went there, one of the assignments we do is to give them some examples of some events and ask them which ones they would investigate. And I'm talking I'm not talking accident investigation here. I'm talking incident investigation, which is more or less the task that is given to the operators in most circumstances. So it's important that operators know how to do this properly, because there's a lot to be just as much to be learnt from an incident investigation as an accident investigation. So when we gave the incidents examples to them and said, select which one you think is the most serious and which one you would then obviously choose to investigate, the choice that was made wasn't correct. And the reason being is they didn't recognise the risk associated with the more serious event. And I asked this person why didn't they choose to investigate this event? And the answer was because it didn't crack. And that statement alone tells you the massive difference between their thinking and other thinking. And interesting enough, at the end of that 5-day, it was over several weeks, but it was 5 days in total. At the end of that training, this person came up to me and said, I want to thank you for showing me a different way to look at safety. And I think that was probably one of the most, defining points there, because it meant that we had got the message across, but not only that, but they could see how that they should look at things differently. So that was one really good example.
Absolutely, yeah. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about, different accidents and incidents that happen. And I realized that, we mostly, pay our attention to those fatal crashes, those horrible tragedies. But there are other things that happen that can cause serious damage. And I was hoping you could tell us a few examples, like what can happen, let's say even, on the ground, that can cause serious damage.
Well, there's lots of things that can happen, but if you've got serious damage, you then fall into the category of an accident.
Yeah.
So, and if you think of it like this, is an incident is almost an accident. So there's something that just stopped it from happening. It could be purely luck, or a change in circumstances or what have you. but that last ingredient wasn't there. But if it had have been there, it would have been a different outcome. So, for example, you might have an aircraft that's making an approach to a runway, and the approach goes very wrong, and the crew managed to escape the situation and salvage the whole event and don't crash. Mm-hmm. But what led up to it is really, really important, because there was the chance that that could have ended differently. And so you need to understand the circumstances leading up to that event, not the fact that it didn't crash, but the fact that they got themselves into trouble in the first place. And if you can understand the reasons why that happened, you can then train people to recognize not to let it happen again. So that's why incident investigation is really, really important.
You mentioned training people, and I was gonna kind of go into the teaching aspect of your career as well. So how did you get into teaching? How did you get from, kind of piloting a plane to, helping others to, as you said, understand the importance of a safety investigation?
Well, I've actually been teaching for as long as I've been flying, just about. So when I was at university, I was learning to fly and getting my various licenses. But I was also learning to become a secondary school teacher, because that was the career that I was going to go. That was the career path I was going to go down. And my career in aviation wasn't guaranteed, not in an airline, for example. So it maybe was something that I would eventually do, but I didn't know when. So I started out teaching secondary school children physics and mathematics, and teaching flying at the same time. So I did the school teaching during the day, and I did the teaching, instructing flying on the weekends, and sometimes at night time during the week. So I was working 7 days a week, basically. And then after a couple of years, I gave away the school teaching and did flying instruction full time, because that was where I really wanted to go. That was where my passion was. So teaching has been in my veins for many, 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 many years. So transforming from what I was doing, flying the aircraft, to teaching people to fly the aircraft, but also teaching people about safety and incident investigation, was an easy transition for me.
I see. And now we also had to, transition into e-learning as well due to the pandemic that is still happening. So do you think that the virtual classes can be the future of aviation training, especially in your field?
The virtual classes have been a really interesting journey for me, because I've had to learn to deliver what I'm teaching differently. Understand that some of it can be done without any interaction, live interaction, but there's some parts that require that live interaction. So when you've got when you don't have live interaction, you've got to be far more precise and anticipating what people may or may not understand. So that for me has been quite an interesting challenge. But in terms of the e-learning thing, I think it's a wonderful opportunity, especially for people who can't travel or people who have limited funding. It's much less expensive to do it this way. But as long as it's constructed in the right way, so the right mix of virtual interaction along with pre-recorded lessons and the right feedback, so that the participants can test that they've understood, or we can, as an instructor, can understand that they have understood what they've been trying to learn. That's if you can combine all of that very carefully, I think it's a very effective way of teaching.
Can you introduce your course? Tell us what it is about and who should benefit from it the most.
Okay, so I'm going to be doing a course on how to investigate incidents, safety incidents. They could be in flight, they could be on the ground, in all different areas, but they're events that aren't an accident, but they can be quite serious in their nature, in that they could have been an accident. And oftentimes these sort of events are left up to the operator themselves to investigate. Now, unless you understand, firstly, the risk associated or the seriousness of these events, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is that you've got to understand how to get to the root cause or causes of why this happened. Because if you don't identify the actual root causes, it could happen again. So identification of what's gone wrong then leads to how can it be fixed. And that involves changing maybe procedures or concentrating on different areas of training, or it could even mean a different criteria for employing people in certain jobs. That was particularly, that was in one case was with ground personnel, with aircraft handling. So a lot of serious events that can be costly occur due to ground handling mistakes, and not even involving pilots or cabin crew or anybody else, but that aspect of the industry is also important. So by teaching people to understand how to solve this event, how to understand why it went wrong and what we can do to stop it happening again or becoming more serious, it's an important facet of the whole safety management system. And so this course is designed to educate or give people the expertise to be able to do that task, because it's not an easy one, and it's really important that it's done properly, because you could spend a lot of time doing something but you may not achieve the right results. And that's why it's important to know the tricks of the trade and the tools to use and how to use them to conduct an investigation, and very importantly, write up a really good report that someone will pick up and say, yes, we do need to change this, or we need to do something differently, or what have you. So who can benefit from it are, well, the organisation itself. That's the number one identity that benefits from this whole process. One of the biggest risks to an organisation is not doing this task properly, because it's a bit like testing the health or measuring the temperature of the organisation. If you don't know that it's unwell, you can't fix it. So that's why this task is really, really important. So the number one benefactor is the organisation itself. The other people who benefit from this are the people within the organisation, because they learn about other events and they understand why something goes wrong, and then they can stop themselves from making the same mistake because they've understood why something happened or why it went wrong. That's another big benefit. So over the course of history, pilots today are a lot safer because other pilots ahead of them have made mistakes. Now, we wouldn't know why those mistakes occurred unless we actually investigated the reasons. So as we move forward in this industry, we're learning from our mistakes, and that's the most important thing. But the other thing is why this work is so important is because we actually don't know in the future what challenges and risks will be to our industry. When I started this 20 odd years ago, this type of work, automation was very, very in its very early days, and not a lot was understood about automation. But in actual fact, at that time, we predicted there would be quite a number of serious events due to automation, because we could see this coming. So we don't know what the next development in the industry will be, but you can be rest assured that it will come with some sort of new problem that we have to solve. And this training helps you to dive into these problems and work out why things go wrong.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point you touched, that you kind of learn from the mistakes from the past, and then you expect to move forward, not making those same mistakes. But at the same time, I think once you kind of get into the routine of it, let's say, your pre-flight safety checks and stuff like that, you might kind of get into that automation yourself as a person. And I think there might be some aspects of those safety checks that might be taken for granted, if you know what I mean, and then ignored maybe most often. It's one of those oh, it's fine, I know it's fine. So can there be something like that, and how to avoid that then?
Yeah, this is very true. Pilots, or what I teach flight crew, is if something doesn't feel right, or it doesn't look right, or it doesn't add up, or it doesn't match, or something like that, don't ignore it. That's number one. You have to sort out why it isn't matching or why it doesn't add up. The point that you make about things becoming habit and you're not recognizing or not doing things as carefully as you should do, I noticed particularly one example of that is running checklists. So you'll see flight crew call an item on the checklist, and you'll see the person answering with the correct response, but they haven't actually checked the item that they're supposed to check. So that's one example. They may also answer something that they don't understand, because they want to keep the checklist rolling. There's a time pressure thing comes into it, and all this sort of stuff. So what crew or everybody in the industry probably needs to learn is that I call it like personal gates. So you stop at a certain point and just make sure that everything that you've done so far is correct before you keep going. But it's a good example. Another example might be cabin crew going through doing their security checks and all that sort of thing, and they're doing it all the time, every day, over and over and over, and they don't see what they're actually looking at, because it's just become routine. So they might be thinking about something else in the back of their mind. So they're actually looking, but they're not actually seeing. So these are sort of human factor elements that creep in sometimes. And if we can recognize those aspects and go, hang on a second, I don't even remember what I just did, so you go back and start again. But it's about understanding that and recognizing that. And sometimes there's events that we see where that sort of behavior comes out, and then you investigate that event, and it's a good reminder to everybody else that this can happen to anybody.
So you moved towards the idea that there's someone who hasn't done their job properly and caused an incident or an accident, and that's a human error, what we call. Can you explain us what hides behind this term? What exactly is human error?
Human error, yeah. there might be several reasons why someone hasn't done their job properly, not only because they're distracted or, they're repeating it over and over again. It might be because they weren't taught correctly in the first place. Mm-hmm. It might be because they're under pressure or distracted. It might be for a lot of different reasons why human beings don't do something correctly or make a mistake. One of the key issues in a lot of events is, for example, communication. So someone may think that they're doing the right thing, but they haven't received the correct message, or they haven't understood the problem and they haven't clarified what it is they're actually supposed to do. So when we talk about human beings making mistakes, human beings will always make mistakes. What we have to learn is why they do it, what circumstances are in which they do it are more likely to happen, what are the other factors that can come into play, how do we recognise them, and how do we build our own self-defence to say, okay, now I've got a situation, I'm on the flight deck, I'm preparing putting some information into the navigation computer, and someone interrupts. Now, I know that interruptions are one of the biggest causes of making a mistake. So it's then about teaching people how to handle the interruption, but it's also teaching the people that are doing the interrupting to learn when not to interrupt, if that makes sense. So it works both ways. So human factors is about understanding the behaviours that can lead to mistakes occurring. I'll give you another example. Is when I'm flying my aeroplane, I sit on the left-hand side, and all the switches are very familiar to me. I know where they are. I don't even have to look. I do look, but I can roughly go to the right place without looking. When I'm instructing maybe and I'm sitting in the other seat, it's all back to front. So I know I have to slow down and I have to be more careful about where I look and take things just much more carefully so that I don't hit the seatbelt sign instead of the rotating beacon or whatever it is that I'm going to select, because I'm out of my normal environment. So that's another example of it being aware of when you can more prone to making mistakes. So that's what all that human factors takes into account. So it takes into account communication, situational awareness, decision making, leadership, a whole bunch of things that come into trying to make as fewer mistakes as possible, but if we do make a mistake, that we can recover from it. We know how to recover.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about, obviously we have a lot of popular media talking about, aircraft accidents. And one movie that comes to my mind was about Captain Sully Sullenberger and the landing on the Hudson.
Yeah.
And in that movie, I remember what really stood out for me was when they were investigating this landing, and they were basically saying that, you made a mistake, you should have went back to LaGuardia and landed there, but you made a choice to, land on a river, which is very dangerous. And they were doing these simulations, and they were saying, oh, you had loads of time to do, a turn, and then you land on the airport. And then I remember Tom Hanks, who was playing Sully, his character said that, well, you don't take into consideration the human factor of the thing. When, something happens, what do you do then? And they show, those clips from the cockpit where, you can see them stressing out, and you see them actually still doing their job properly, but like thinking, that what's going to happen. And I thought, how do pilots deal with it? How can you prepare for something like that? Is there training? How do you deal with this?
Yeah, it's got a term. It's known as Startle effect. So it's when something that happens that is unexpected, completely unexpected, and we do try to train for certain, train that you can't train every single event, but you can train pilots in this startle sort of phenomena. I'll give you one example where we investigated one of our aircraft had a very bad engine failure after takeoff. And it was caused by ice going into the engine. So when we're in a simulator, we train engine failures over and over and over and over. But this particular engine failure was very, very different to the standard sort of engine failure, if I could call that standard. Now, that took the crew several seconds to comprehend what was going on because it was something they hadn't seen before. But they're trained to snap out of it. So it can happen in many, many different ways. But what the crew are trained to do is to analyze it quickly as they can. But if it's something that's going to take more time, they have to go back and do the things that they've been trained to do, and then prioritize their tasks. And that's another human factor thing, is the ability to prioritize what's important.
And I think at the same time it goes that you can make a mistake, like the human error, but also, let's say, a pilot is the first line of defense in a situation, so it kind of goes both ways, right?
Well, that's right, because what we don't measure is how many times the human being prevents something from happening. So they step in and catch something before it goes wrong due to maybe an equipment failure or something else that causes something drastic. And it's the human being that can step in and fix that up. We don't measure that at all.
I see. Well, it's all very interesting. I mean, obviously, accidents are not something really nice to talk about, but it's still useful to know, the importance and, how can then, even though like it happens, it can improve us then, I guess, moving forward. So I want to thank you, Deborah, for sharing your thoughts with me today and for joining me. And is there anything else you want to say to our viewers that might consider taking your course at Aeroclass?
Well, all I would like to say is that once you've done some work or some study in this area, it becomes a very passionate topic, and it's extremely interesting. And the people who get involved in it work together really, really well. And there's a lot of, it creates a lot of connections around the world, because we can compare stories, we can compare all sorts of different things with one another. We're not in competition with one another. We're all trying to help each other become safer. And I think that's what is the nicest thing about this particular subject, is that it is helpful to everybody.
Well, what a nice way to end this conversation. So thanks for everyone who's watching. If you want to check out Deborah's course, please visit aeroclass.org and find it there. Thank you very much and take care.